Imagine a world where everything that was once believed as truth is nothing more than a constructed illusion. Throughout centuries, an image of Jesus Christ has been embedded in the minds of millions, a serene figure with pale skin, soft brown hair, and blue eyes. This version of Jesus has stood since 2001 as a symbol in churches, paintings, and films, shaping the way people understand faith, divinity, and even themselves. Yet, this portrayal is not based on historical reality. The real Jesus, who walked the earth over 2,000 years ago, did not resemble the image that the world has presented. From the dusty roads of ancient Judea to the towering pyramids of Egypt, the presence of dark-skinned people in biblical stories is undeniable. The Middle Eastern region where Jesus was born and raised was a cultural crossroads where Africa, Asia, and Europe met. The people of that time had deep brown skin, thick curly hair, and strong defined features. Their appearance reflected the sun-drenched lands they inhabited. The scientific and historical evidence confirms that Jesus, too, would have had dark skin, thick hair, and Middle Eastern facial characteristics. The Bible itself provides strong clues. The book of Revelation describes Jesus as having hair like wool and feet that resembled bronze burned in a furnace. These descriptions paint an unmistakable picture of a man with dark features, a stark contrast to the fair-skinned representations found in Western religious art. The Gospel of Matthew records that King Herod's order to kill male infants forced Jesus' family to seek refuge in Egypt. For them to blend in with the Egyptian population, they could not have looked noticeably different from the native people whose skin was rich in melanin and whose features aligned more with African and Middle Eastern heritage than with European ancestry. The manipulation of Jesus' image did not happen overnight. It was a process that began long after his lifetime, evolving with the shifting tides of power. In early Christianity, depictions of Jesus varied across regions. In parts of Africa and the Middle East, he was often portrayed with darker skin. However, as Christianity spread into Europe, the image of Jesus began to change. During the Renaissance period, artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci painted Jesus in their own likeness, depicting him as a European man. These artistic interpretations became so influential that they solidified themselves as the standard representation of Christ, completely overshadowing historical accuracy. With the expansion of European empires, the white depiction of Jesus became more than just an artistic choice. It became a tool of domination. As colonizers spread their influence across Africa, the Americas, and Asia, they imposed their rule and reshaped religious narratives to maintain power. A white Jesus reinforced the idea of European superiority, subtly suggesting that divinity itself bore their image. This portrayal seeped into missionary efforts, where indigenous and African communities were taught that their own appearance was inferior, while the European face of Christ symbolized salvation. Enslaved Africans were forcibly converted to Christianity, but were shown a version of faith that justified their suffering. Anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians have reconstructed what a typical Jewish man from 1st century Galilee would have looked like. The conclusion is strikingly different from the familiar paintings seen today. The reconstruction shows a man with dark, olive-toned skin, short curly hair, and broad facial features. The historical Jesus was a man of the people, living among the poor, the outcasts, and the oppressed. He was born in a region that saw a mixture of African, Semitic, and Middle Eastern cultures. Remember to join our community by subscribing to this channel. The white European image of Jesus erases this reality, stripping away the cultural context that shaped his life and teachings. Reclaiming the true image of Jesus is more than a matter of historical accuracy. It is an act of restoring identity and breaking free from the imposed stories that have long shaped societies. Churches and scholars in African and African American communities have been reclaiming this history, embracing an image of Christ that reflects their own heritage. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian traditions, has depicted Jesus with dark skin for centuries, long before European influences attempted to redefine his appearance. The transformation of Jesus' image did not happen overnight. It was a slow, calculated process that began long after his death. The earliest Christians in the first few centuries after his crucifixion had no universal depiction of Jesus. In the Roman catacombs, the first known Christian art, dating back to the 3rd century AD, showed Jesus as a youthful, beardless man, similar to Greek gods, symbolizing his divinity rather than his physical form. There was no single image that defined him, and early Christians focused more on his teachings than on his appearance. However, as Christianity gained influence, particularly after Emperor Constantine's conversion in 312 AD, the Roman Empire began shaping Christian theology and iconography to align with its own ideals. By 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea had established the foundational doctrines of Christianity, and with it, the representation of Jesus began to take on a more defined and politically motivated form. Rome's influence led to the depiction of Jesus as a figure of imperial majesty, often adorned in robes reminiscent of Roman emperors. The Byzantine era, 4th to 15th century AD, solidified the first standardized images of Christ, showing him with a solemn expression, golden halo, and European-like features. Yet, even then, variations existed across different regions. In parts of Africa and the Middle East, Jesus was often portrayed with darker skin, closer to the people who lived in those areas. The real shift happened during the Renaissance period, 14th to 17th century AD, when European artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael redefined Jesus' image to reflect the aesthetics and racial characteristics of European high society. This shift was not just about art, it was about control, influence, and Eurocentrism. The most famous depictions of Jesus, Michelangelo's Last Judgment, 1536 to 1541, Da Vinci's The Last Supper, 1495 to 1498, and countless others, cemented the idea that Christ was European. These artistic interpretations were more than religious devotion. They became political statements. A white Jesus aligned with the European ideals of beauty, civilization, and divine favor. The Church, intertwined with European monarchies, promoted these images, reinforcing the idea that power and holiness belonged to those who looked like the figures in these paintings. These images of Jesus traveled the world as Europe expanded its influence through colonization. During the 16th and 17th centuries, as European missionaries traveled to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they did not only bring Christianity, they brought a Europeanized version of Christianity. The image of a white Jesus became a psychological weapon used to convert indigenous populations while simultaneously conditioning them to see European culture as superior. The doctrine of discovery, 1493, issued by Pope Alexander VI, justified European colonial expansion and the forced conversion of native peoples. Christianity was used as a tool for domination, and with it came the image of a white Jesus, presented as the ultimate savior, one that conveniently resembled the very people seizing land and enslaving millions. The transatlantic slave trade, 16th to 19th century, exemplified this, stripping enslaved Africans of their identities, cultures, and belief systems. They were forcibly converted to Christianity, but instead of being taught about a liberating Jesus who stood with the oppressed, they were given a version that validated their suffering. Even beyond slavery, this image persisted. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as Western powers continued to exert control over Africa and other regions, religious institutions played a significant role in spreading the idea of a white savior. Christian missionaries built schools, churches, and hospitals, embedding the European Jesus deeper into the consciousness of colonized people. The consequences of this manipulation have been profound. For centuries, people of African and Middle Eastern descent were made to feel disconnected from their faith, forced to see God in an image that was not their own. This issue was not just about race, it was about power, about shaping the minds of millions to accept a hierarchy where whiteness was divine and everything else was secondary. The age of colonial expansion, beginning in the 15th century, saw European nations embark on vast conquests across Africa, the Americas, and parts of Asia. These explorations were not just about territory, they were about reshaping the world to reflect European ideals. As countries like Spain, Portugal, Britain, and France spread their empires, they also spread their version of Christianity. This transformation did not spare the image of Jesus. As these missionaries preached salvation, they also enforced the idea that Christianity was synonymous with European civilization. The introduction of a white Jesus to indigenous populations created an association between whiteness and holiness, while non-European cultures were labeled as pagan, primitive, or even evil. The forced conversion of African, Native American, and Asian peoples was not just about bringing them to Christ, it was about erasing their identities and replacing them with an image of faith that reinforced colonial dominance. The most devastating impact of this religious colonialism occurred in Africa and the Americas during the 16th to 19th centuries, when European powers used Christianity to justify the transatlantic slave trade. Over 12 million Africans were captured, enslaved, and transported to the Americas under the guise of civilizing them. White European slave traders and plantation owners preached obedience using a version of Christianity that encouraged submission. Bible passages were twisted to convince enslaved Africans that their suffering was God's plan and that salvation was only possible by obeying their white masters. During this period, enslaved people were introduced to a distorted gospel, one that presented Jesus as a gentle, white savior who rewarded those who accepted their oppression. Many people used the concept of the curse of Ham, a misinterpretation of a passage in the book of Genesis, Genesis 9:20-27, to justify slavery. Are you enjoying the story? Support our channel by clicking the subscribe button. According to this flawed interpretation, Noah cursed his son Ham's descendants, condemning them to a life of servitude. European colonizers used this story to argue that African people were destined to be enslaved, embedding a dangerous and false theological justification for racial inequality. In the United States and the Caribbean, enslaved Africans were baptized into a Christianity that bore little resemblance to the faith practiced in the early church. The message of liberation, central to Jesus' teachings, was stripped away, and in its place enslaved people were given sermons about obedience and endurance. They were denied access to the full Bible, with certain passages deliberately removed to prevent them from drawing inspiration from stories of resistance, like Moses leading the Israelites out of slavery, Exodus 14:21-31. Despite these efforts, enslaved Africans found ways to reclaim their faith. In secret gatherings known as hush harbors, they interpreted the gospel through their own lens, identifying with the struggles of the oppressed in the Bible rather than the stories imposed upon them. They saw Jesus not as a European figure of control, but as a liberator, a figure who stood against injustice, challenged corrupt leaders, and fought for the poor. Over time, this understanding of Christ gave birth to movements like Black liberation theology, which emphasized Jesus' role as an ally of the marginalized. As colonial rule spread further across Africa and Asia in the 19th and early 20th centuries, European powers intensified their efforts to reshape societies. Schools, churches, and governments were established with the explicit goal of civilizing non-European people. The image of a white Jesus was a key part of this process, ensuring that Christianity remained tied to colonial rule. The Book of Revelation, 1:14-15, offers one of the most compelling biblical references to Jesus' physical traits. The passage describes him with hair like wool and feet like bronze burned in a furnace. Woolly hair is a distinctive feature of people of African and Middle Eastern descent, and the reference to his feet being like burned bronze strongly suggests a darker complexion. This description does not fit the pale-skinned depiction often presented in churches and religious media. Another significant clue is found in Matthew 2:13-15, which recounts how Jesus' family fled to Egypt to escape King Herod's decree to kill all male infants. The decision to hide in Egypt, a region inhabited by dark-skinned people, implies that Jesus and his parents would not have stood out among the local population. If Jesus had been pale-skinned and European-looking, his presence in Egypt would have been easily noticed, making it an unsafe place to hide. Instead, the fact that they sought refuge there suggests that Jesus physically resembled the people of that land. The Old Testament prophecy in Isaiah 53:2 provides further insight, stating that Jesus had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, and that nothing in his appearance made him desirable. The evidence indicates that Jesus was an average-looking man for his time and region. Since the people of ancient Judea were of Middle Eastern and African descent, it is logical to conclude that Jesus shared their dark complexion and distinct features. A groundbreaking study conducted in 2001 by forensic anthropologists used skulls from first-century Jewish men to reconstruct a scientifically accurate representation of Jesus. The findings showed a man with dark, short, curly black hair and strong Semitic features, a stark contrast to the Renaissance-era paintings that depict him as light-skinned with long, flowing hair. This forensic reconstruction aligns with what is known about the ethnic makeup of the people living in Judea at the time. In addition to physical appearance, Jesus' ancestry further supports the case for his non-European identity. The genealogy of Jesus, as outlined in the Gospels of Matthew 1:1-16 and Luke 3:23-38, traces his lineage through a long line of Jewish ancestors, many of whom had African and Middle Eastern roots. His great-grandmother, Rahab, was a Canaanite woman from Jericho, and King Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, was married to Uriah the Hittite, a group with known African ancestry. The Israelite people themselves were closely connected to Egypt, Ethiopia, and other African civilizations, further demonstrating the deep cultural and genetic ties between Jesus and the African world. Trade routes between Africa and the Middle East during Jesus' time also played a significant role in shaping the ethnic diversity of the region. The ancient kingdom of Kush, modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia, had strong connections with Israel and Judea, facilitating a constant exchange of people, goods, and ideas. African influence was deeply embedded in the fabric of Jewish society, making it highly likely that Jesus encountered, interacted with, and even shared ancestry with African-descended people. Even in the New Testament, African presence in early Christianity is undeniable. Simon of Cyrene, the man who helped Jesus carry the cross, was from Cyrene, an ancient city in modern-day Libya. The Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in Acts 8:26-40 was one of the earliest known non-Jewish converts to Christianity. These accounts reveal that African individuals were not only present, but also played significant roles in the life and early spread of Jesus' teachings. For centuries, these historical and biblical facts have been overlooked or deliberately ignored in favor of maintaining the whitewashed image of Jesus. The Europeanized portrayal of Christ has been used as a tool to support colonialism, slavery, and racial superiority, distorting the truth to fit a particular narrative. Recognizing Jesus as a man of color does not change his message of love, justice, and redemption. It strengthens it. Acknowledging his true identity restores the historical integrity of Christianity and allows people of all backgrounds to see themselves reflected in the faith. The truth about Jesus' identity has been buried beneath layers of artistic distortion, political manipulation, and historical revision. His image was reshaped to serve the interests of empires, colonizers, and religious institutions that sought to align divinity with power, erasing the reality of his true appearance. But the evidence, both biblical and historical, tells a different story. Jesus was not the pale-skinned figure seen in churches, cathedrals, and religious paintings. He was a dark-skinned man, a Middle Eastern Jew who bore the features of the people from the region he lived in. If you're enjoying this story and want to help spread the truth, hit the Super Thanks button. Your support is making a difference, helping us reveal hidden history. For centuries, the global order concealed this truth, associating whiteness with divinity, civilization, and authority. European nations, through colonization and religious expansion, crafted an image of Christ that reinforced their dominance. By portraying Jesus as a European figure, they justified oppression, reshaped spiritual beliefs, and conditioned entire populations to see salvation through the lens of those in power. This wasn't just about faith, it was about control, and it succeeded in shaping the way millions viewed God, themselves, and their place in the world. The psychological impact of the whitewashing of Jesus runs deep. People of African, Middle Eastern, and indigenous descent felt disconnected from the divine for generations. The very faith that was born in their lands was stripped of its roots, repackaged, and handed back to them in a form that denied their own history and contributions. Christianity did not originate in Europe, yet for hundreds of years, the version of Jesus that was spread across the globe bore no resemblance to the man who walked the streets of Judea. Researchers, theologians, and historians are revealing a reality that has remained hidden for centuries. The movement to restore the historical Jesus is not about race alone, it is about honesty, identity, and justice. Recognizing Jesus as a Middle Eastern dark-skinned man dismantles centuries of deception and restores dignity to those whose identities were erased. Jesus stood for the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed. His message was one of justice, resistance against corruption, and the elevation of those whom society ignored. His skin color does not change the essence of his teachings, but acknowledging his true identity strengthens the connection between his life and the struggles of people who have been excluded and exploited. Thanks for watching. Join our community by subscribing to this channel. Until the next video.